this session we'll have two great speakers, Eric von Hippel from MIT and Bob Langer, also from MIT. And the two of them have collaborated over many, many years with Portugal and in particular with Portuguese researchers. Over the last years, Eric has been a major supporter and promoter of the initiative Helena Canhão and Pedro Oliveira launched, Patient Innovation, and he has certainly influenced not only them and the group of user innovators that have been showing to the world why we can promote innovation from patients, but also worldwide. He has been particularly dedicated to a better understanding of the ways we innovate and we can improve the relationships between society at large and those which produce knowledge. I have the opportunity to meet Eric many, many years ago at MIT and in many OECD contexts where Eric has always been a driver of a better understanding on the way people engage in a knowledge-driven society. But in the last 10 years, as I mentioned, Eric has been particularly important and relevant in promoting patient innovation with Helena and Pedro Oliveira, and for all the support he has given to researchers in Portugal. We have awarded him with the Portuguese Science Medal, and I'm very, very pleased to again acknowledge his contribution for the way we look at innovation in Portugal in the European context. Actually, Eric, you should be pleased to understand that last summer the European Commission has recognized Portugal as one of the European strong innovators country, and that is very, very much associated with the way SMEs at large and startups, and particularly academic-driven startups, has become so influential in our society. And again, lessons learned from the way we can open up the access to knowledge, and particularly using many of your understanding on the way we and should understanding open innovation are particularly critical for our current positioning in Portugal, in Europe, and in the world at large.
Okay. So let me say I'm enormously honored by this. I have indeed, through MIT and directly in Portugal, built a wonderful relationship, a research relationship, and I'm very aware of the very important contributions that Portugal is making and has made to our overall effort and to Portugal's unique sort of strength in the area of these new innovation methodologies. In my talk, I will discuss user innovation as an important general phenomenon, and also will discuss the major contributions being made by Portugal patient innovation scholars, specifically Professor Oliveira and Professor Cajano, as also mentioned by Minister Heitor. So let me first begin with context, because I understand that our audience is quite a general one, and you know, that's always a wonderful thing. So let me first say that in economics, product users have traditionally been thought of as passive innovators. They're simply users of what the producers might give to them. So this was central. It was started out by Schumpeter in 1934, and it really is driving innovation practice and policy to these days. But it is wrong and it is incomplete, as we now, with work in Portugal and around the world, understand. So the model that that Schumpeter put forward and that has been driving things like patents and all these government policies to date is called the linear innovation model, and it is that a producer does market research, research and development, production, market diffusion. So for example, it would never occur within this kind of a situation that a user would see an innovation that the user needed for his or her or itself and would develop it for itself. It simply is not done. Instead, what happens, this theory, which is dominating the world today in terms of public policy and practice, is no, it is the producers who innovate, it is the users who have needs. So here, when I was a young man, my father was a professor at MIT as well, and I used to, ever since age 12, go around the corridors and I would see what scientists were doing in their various labs. And one of the things that I saw was that in fact the scientists were the ones, the users of scientific instruments, were the ones who were developing their own instruments. It wasn't the Schumpeterian argument that a producer was coming and saying, aha, I see your need, Mr. Scientist, I will create a product for you. Instead, it was that the scientists developed what they need before there was a commercial product. This is an example, because this is a science medal. This is an example from scientific instruments. And what you see here is electron spectroscopy for chemical analysis, ESCA. As you can see from the image on the left, it's a pretty complicated device. It involves vacuums and electron beams and so on and so forth, and is complicated. It was developed by scientists who needed to study the surfaces of solids. It was not developed by companies saying, aha, I see you have a need. And what you can see from that chart there at the bottom is that the users developed and improved this innovation for years and years before finally a producer began to make it. This is very different than the situation that is commonly discussed, namely that the producer sees a need. It's extremely different, but it turns out to be very general. Now let me switch to, and by the way, you can see a reason here at the bottom. Basically, what's happening in the beginning is there's no market. For a really big innovation, there's no clear market. So producers have no incentive to enter, and users do, because individual scientists absolutely need this device to pursue their important research. So now, this is also true in medical areas. It's true, in fact, in general, in the consumer area. So suppose your child had a serious disease and medical firms were not offering what was urgently needed. What would you do? I'll bet you just wouldn't sit there and say, oh gosh, I hope someday a company comes and produces something to save my child. You, if you had the skills, would do something about it. And this is the general principle underlying the research of the patient innovation initiative of Pedro and Elena and others, and the general idea that it's users as well as producers who innovate. So I'm now going to give you an example of how this works. This example is what's called the artificial pancreas. And it is about something needed by people with type 1 diabetes. These people make 300 plus decisions a day that influence their blood glucose. They can make mistakes, and mistakes can be fatal. In fact, 5% of type 1 diabetics die by making a mistake over their lifetime. Typically, they make a mistake at night. They take too much glucose, and then they fall asleep, and they fall into a coma. Now, this happened to Dana. Dana Lewis, you see here on the left, and her husband, Scott LeBrand. Dana is a type 1 diabetic. And Dana made a miscalculation one night and went to sleep. She had, as usual, a juice box with sugar on her bedside table, because that's what type 1 diabetics do. If they make a miscalculation and they wake up in time, they can sip the juice from a juice box and save themselves. But Dana woke up too late. She could see the juice box, but she could not move her muscles to save herself. Luckily, Scott came in and saved her. Now, what is needed by these people, the reason the mistakes are made, is because there's so many complicated calculations that you have to make as a diabetic. You, for example, when you're having a meal, you have to estimate the carbs you're going to eat. You have to then correct for insulin resistance you may have, for your activities prior, like walking to the dinner, your activities post, like sitting still, and the amount of insulin you have on board. And then you must inject the correct insulin dose. No wonder lots of errors are made. Well, what could be done about this? Dana was afraid to go to sleep after this, as I would be as well. But Scott was a software engineer. And Scott said, this is ridiculous. We need to make an artificial calculation pancreas, a device basically that will calculate for Dana, using her rules, the amount of insulin she should take. What it does, in other words, currently we have a continuous blood glucose measuring device. Companies sell those. We also have insulin pumps. So in ordinary practice today, what you do is you look at your measurements on the blood glucose device, you do your manual calculations, and then you press the button on the insulin pump to give yourself insulin. What's missing is that box in red, namely something to automatically calculate the dosage. So what happened? Companies were saying, oh, wait 5 years, this is so hard, you can't expect us to do it right away. Dana and Scott built an artificial pancreas to automatically adjust insulin levels on Dana's insulin pump. Others helped. So in other words, they, in a few months, developed what companies said would take years. They developed it because they needed it. And what you see here is the first such device that was openly shared, artificial pancreas system design. In other words, what Dana and Scott did is they built this device, they used this device, they saw that their blood levels were improved. Here you see Dana's levels. She actually tracked her blood levels of glucose. The outcomes were better. She kept within range better than her manual calculations did. And then what did they do? They posted it on the web. So thousands of other people using these designs and updated ones are accumulating millions of safe, quote, flight hours with the same good results. Notice what this is. This is users solving their own needs when companies don't do it. Now, today, we have this thing continuously evolving, and it is, not many dollars, a couple of $100 versus what is now an available commercial device, which is $8,000. So many people still prefer the open APS, and they use it because it was inexpensive and because it's better. Now, recall again that in economics, product users have traditionally been viewed as passive. But now we see that's really not true. And what happened amongst my colleagues around the world is that we decided that we were going to measure for the first time the amount of innovation by consumers in the household sectors. So this would not count the scientists who also innovate, as we saw, for their own needs. This would count only consumers. This would count individual people living in their own homes, innovating for their own use. Now, when we first proposed to do this, it was quite astonishing from the perspective of the researchers, but we managed to do these standard surveys across 10 countries. And what you see is that it's about 6% of the population that innovates. This is a massive number of people. Across 10 countries, it's 65 million people. It is absolutely an amazing amount of people innovating. Consider the UK survey. Two interesting general features are visible. It's big scale and it's free. That means, just like Dana and Scott, they create these innovations as householders. They don't sell them, they give them away. So first, you see here the percentage of population in England. It is 2.9 million people. That is 100 times more than all the people developing products for consumers. In other words, this massive effort has been invisible. Why has it been invisible? It has been invisible because, number one, the Schumpeterian argument said it shouldn't exist. And number two, since it's done for free, created at private cost in homes, and given away for free, there are no economic measures that were automatically generated to make it visible. There are no patents, and so on and so forth. And yet what we see here is that the annual consumer spending on R&D for products for themselves is $5.2 billion. That's 140% of what the companies are doing. So it's a huge phenomenon, and it's very important. The measures that we use, we calculate this very carefully. We just simply only accept things where users say, yes, they have created or modified something. It is not job related. In other words, they didn't do their work for IBM at home. It is not available on the market, and it is functionally novel. It improves things for the performance of whatever that user is trying to do. So the innovations we record are, in fact, very conservatively recorded. Now, what do we have? What we end up with then, and this is sort of the arena within which Pedro and I and Elena and others in Portugal and many around the world work, what you see is a brand new innovation paradigm. Basically, it's users, self-rewarded, innovating and revealing for free, and then diffusing for free to others without protecting their innovations. Some of you may know about open source software, and you will see that pattern. People innovate for themselves, they just put it into a commons, and then they share it openly, other people improve it, and so on. You can see how enormously different it is than the innovation paradigm that has been traditional in the Schumpeterian world at the bottom. It is not about money, but it has enormous impacts, as we will see. Innovation designs that users make are often behind what producers are making. Why do they create innovations at their private cost and then give them away? It is because they are self-rewarded. This is a cluster analysis from Finland, and what you see here in these circles is the reasons that people give for why they innovated. You can see that users there, named after the biggest portion of the cluster, is personal need driven. That would be the case for the artificial pancreas that we just described. But there are also people innovating because they enjoy it. Those are participators. They learn from it. There are people helping others, like you would help your child. And finally, just 9% of the sample is producers. They are innovating to sell something. And so they are ones who make patents and so on. Now, again, because users are self-rewarded, they tend to pioneer. Why is this? You can see this curve. This is a standard market curve. It grows and then it declines over time. And at the very beginning of that curve, that's where you find these innovating users. It is not clear yet whether there's a market. And as a consequence, producers are not interested because they need a lot of product sales in order to, in fact, benefit from their innovations. Now, what happens then is that users pioneer, as in the case of the artificial pancreas. And therefore, it's very important to think about how those innovations get out to the general population. And here we come back to Pedro and Elena and the patient website that they have created, along with many colleagues as well. And this is why it's such a joy to work with them and the fundamental work that they are doing. How does this fit in? It looks from this like everything is under control, but in fact, there is a problem. The user innovation paradigm that we see on the top there involves people rewarding themselves. In other words, I develop an artificial pancreas to help my wife. I don't develop it to sell it. I am self-rewarded. Once I have helped my wife, then I have gotten my reward. I have no incentive to diffuse it further. This is a problem because, in fact, as you see in the bottom arrow, diffusion is driven by producers relentlessly. Producers are not self-rewarded. They only get benefit when they sell something to somebody else. So they will work really hard to diffuse their innovations. On the other hand, user innovators who solve their own problems are not motivated so strongly in this direction. So we see this in the data. What we can see, this is a study again in Finland of diffusion effort. And what we see is that innovations that are very valuable to many, that's the one in the red circle, only 23% of the innovators make any effort at all to inform either their peers or to inform producers. Now that is the problem that Pedro and Elena and their center are working upon. And it's a central problem to this newly emerging innovation world that we see. Basically, what you have is innovations that their patient innovation site collects. So they, the user again has no particular incentive to diffuse it. The center that Pedro and Elena built is in fact going out proactively and getting these innovations, because one of the forms of diffusion is to bring them to a point where others can see them. Then what they do is they explore the pattern by which these innovations do or can diffuse. Here are two examples from their site. You see an insulin port there. Again, it's for diabetes, and what it is sort of this little sort of device that you put under your skin. You adhere it to your skin so that when you make an injection, you don't always have to puncture yourself again and again as a diabetic. Instead, you sort of inject the insulin dose you want within this sort of plastic port. Now, developed by a patient who did not want to repeatedly stick herself, and acquired by Medtronics. Medtronics then, an existing firm, became the method to diffuse that important patient innovation. Another example is another method. This is the shower shirt. Here is a patient startup. What this amounts to is a woman had a mastectomy and was told by her doctors when she said, well, I want to shower, what should I do to protect the incisions and so on? And they said, well, just make a hole in a garbage bag and put it over your head. This was ridiculous from this person's perspective. And so what she did was make a shower shirt for herself. You can see there in the middle of that second row, what she did was she created sort of pockets in it so that she could put her drains and so on into safe locations while she took a shower. And she started a company. Well, that is excellent. But those self-done, self-achieved diffusions are relatively rare. There's an enormous amount more of very important innovations out there that have to be somehow diffused more effectively. And this kind of research that the Patient Innovation Group is doing, conducting research on all diffusion options, providing practical support and teaching. It's a wonderful phenomenon, and Portugal is the leader due to your wonderful academic colleagues here. Now, free innovation, this kind of innovation I'm talking about, is getting bigger and bigger, so that what Pedro and Elena and many of us around the world are doing is getting to be more and more important. Producer innovation is getting outshadowed increasingly by this kind of innovation that I showed you, whether it's the scientific instrument being developed by scientists, or the medical innovations being developed by medical people, or in every other field, innovations being done by users for themselves. So what you see is that design costs are dropping due to computerization. Communication costs are dropping due to the internet. So what we now can have is large-scale projects like Linux that can outdo the kinds of projects that producers come up with. And you see then that the producer, if you think of it as design costs are dropping and communication costs are dropping due to the internet, basically all innovation opportunities are moving downward to the left into areas where these collaborative user innovation activities can occur. So we now, with help of Portugal and other countries, we now have managed to make the definition of innovation, have changed it to include both patient and free and open innovation. Previously, it was outside of the OECD official definition. All of us working together have now made it part of the definition. So we are moving this kind of activity from the research sphere to policy and practice. And I'm hugely happy to be participating in this activity along with my colleagues in Portugal. Thank you very much.